I'm Alex Lawson, filling in for Richard RJ Eskow, and I'm really pleased to be joined by phone with Dr. John Powers. He is a professor of clinical medicine at George Washington University and a clinician, an expert on drug pricing and specifically on antibiotics. Dr. Powers, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for the invitation.
So tell us a little bit about your work on antibiotics. I think a lot of people have heard about antibiotic resistance, that there is this risk that antibiotics are going to stop working. You see, mainstream news articles of that nature. Can you dive into the issue a little bit deeper and tell us how the pharmaceutical industry plays in this space?
Sure. The issue with antibiotics since their first development in the 1930s and 1940s has always been this issue that they can lose their effectiveness over time. And that has been termed antibiotic resistance. And in fact, when penicillin was introduced in the 1940s, by the 1950s, almost 98% of Staphylococcus aureus, which is a common organism that causes skin infections, had become resistant to it. Having said that, though, there's a flip side to that discussion. For instance, group A streptococci, which cause strep throat, have remained sensitive to penicillin for the last 80 years. So it's very difficult to predict in which organisms resistance might develop and how fast that might develop. And the important point to take out of this is that the vast majority of people still have an antibiotic that is effective for them. So, of course, it makes sense to try to develop drugs that are better for both current and for future patients. And that's what we'd always like to do, not just in antibiotics, but in any field. We like to develop better cancer drugs, better drugs for heart disease, etc. So, but what's happened here in antibiotics is that instead of developing drugs that are better for current patients, we have slipped into a paradigm based on trying to incentivize the drug industry, where the trials are almost universally designed to allow the new drugs to be worse than a drug that you can get already that's effective in patients that already have effective options. And that's really something that's not done in other therapeutic areas. When those kinds of trials are done, it's usually a trade-off. So, for instance, if you are giving an anticoagulant drug to thin somebody's blood, a new one may have less bleeding. So to avoid that side effect, patients may be willing to give up a little of the effectiveness of that drug to have less bleeding. So in other words, the only reason to ever give up any effectiveness from a currently effective drug is if you get something else back for it, and that's usually something on the order of decreased serious adverse effects. That's not the way these studies are used in antibiotics. The way that they're used in antibiotics is to study current patients who have effective options with no real benefit for them at all in terms of decreased adverse effects, with the notion that, one, it's easier for drug companies to get their drug approved by a regulatory agency if they study patients that are more common, and secondly, the idea that even though those drugs might be a little worse today, that somehow those drugs might be better for patients in the future. And there's two issues with that are really problematic. The first is we don't know that. Patients who have resistant infections tend to be older and sicker than patients who have susceptible infections. And therefore, a drug that might be a little worse in patients that are less sick might be markedly worse in people who are very sick. But you won't know that if you don't study the drug in those exact patients that have no options. The second thing is that the economics of this sort of incentivizes companies to sell more of their drug faster, which means that resistance will develop to any new drug over time. So in the future, it might not be effective either. So, for instance, there's a thing called the net present value equation, which says that money for a pharmaceutical company that develops a new drug is worth more for them today than it's going to be 10 years from now. So there's no expectation that the drug company would develop a new antibiotic and then save it for the future when it might actually be needed. So the real question is, are we being told that these drugs are going to be beneficial in the future when in fact the plan is to sell them now, which is what the economics of the situation would dictate for a pharmaceutical company? And then the third question is, even if it's a laudable goal to develop better drugs for the future, that shouldn't be done at the cost of exposing current patients who have effective options to increased harm. And in fact, that violates the basic principles in many of the ethical documents related to clinical research. For instance, the Declaration of Helsinki points out that patients should not be exposed not just to placebo, but shouldn't be exposed to any drug less effective than the best one if they might suffer irreversible harm. And if we're talking about potentially fatal diseases like pneumonia, why should a patient who has pneumonia and might die from it and has an effective option be subjected to a drug that's any less worse or any less effective than one they could get already? The interesting thing about this is that there's a lot of illogic and double talk that goes along with this. So, for instance, these studies are actually too small to clearly show that the drug is worse than the older alternative. And so that is then portrayed as, well, we really don't know that that drug is worse, and it might be better.
Dr.
So in a
Powers,
way,
let me ask you...
That's using uncertainty in the wrong way. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Let me ask you just, there's a lot here, so let me try to break it down slightly, which is
sure.
The interplay between science, the best science that we have, and the drive of pharmaceutical companies to maximize their profits. So we always want to have medicine driven by the best science, and the pharmaceutical companies are not driven by that. They're very clearly driven by their bottom line. So you just brought up clinical studies. That's an area where the pharmaceutical companies have a real hold over the public because they control those studies and whether they're released or not. So there's this huge problem there where the companies are going to obviously not show data that impacts their bottom line, even if it's the best science and should drive our use of medicine and creation of new drugs. So is that a decent breakdown of what we're talking about with new antibiotics?
Yeah, I think you brought up two issues in what you just said. One is, where are you going to put your priorities? And these are not mutually exclusive. A company can make a profit and still help patients at the same time if they're doing appropriate science. Where the system goes off the rails is if we prioritize incentivizing companies to get a return on their investment, and we're not ensuring that we're benefiting patients. So that's your first point. And the second point you bring up is one about transparency. And that is, when we see a study that's published in a medical journal or we see a news article about it that says new drug X is great, how do we know that's actually true if we can't actually analyze the data in an independent way? And some places, like in Europe, have been trying to make that information more available to scientists and to the public. Currently, in the United States, the FDA considers that information proprietary and owned by the companies. And so, therefore, it's very difficult for scientists to get their hands on the information and to do their own analyses. And what's interesting about that is part of science is that other people should be able to confirm your work. Mm-hmm. And so without the ability to do that, how do you know that the data has been presented properly and in a truthful way?
So one thing that's clear is we can only see the studies that they release. So even that is not accessible to outside review. But also, all the data from studies that they choose not to release is completely unavailable, including if public money, if tax dollars are going into the development of these drugs at any point along the way, which a massive percentage of all new drugs are actually funded at some point by the public. So what's a solution to this? Because from my point of view, if a company is developing a drug and even a penny of public dollars went into that process. I feel like all the data should be publicly available for the benefit of science and for the understanding that there's public investment in this. And so in a very straightforward way, these drugs are public goods. We pay for them not to massively profit a private pharmaceutical company who are massively profitable already, but to develop new drugs to better the public health. Is that a movement that you're seeing to make studies publicly available?
A move to do this in Europe. In fact, we just published a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association Internal Medicine about a month ago that was based on obtaining the consent forms from 70 antibiotic trials from the European Medicines Agency, because they have a program that makes the information from the trials available. We could not have done that if we had written the FDA, because they would not make that information available. So I think there are places in the world that are actually trying to address this. And as I said, it's part of the scientific process. It's also interesting that research is starting to show the lack of ability to confirm the results of positive-looking trials. In other words, the scientific method consists of making an observation, forming a hypothesis about that observation, testing it in an experiment, and then confirming the results. Because a test may come out or an experiment may come out positive just by chance alone, even if you do everything right. So one of the basic tenets of science is to confirm that information by getting either more information or replicating that experiment. What we're seeing, though, as what our Congress has passed recently in the 21st Century Cures Bill, is a move to provide clinicians and patients with less and less and less information about new medical products, including drugs, devices, and biological products like vaccines, again with the idea that we need to maximize profits for companies because they, as when I testified in front of Congress, a congressman said, because they pay taxes and support jobs. And of course, that's a very beneficial thing, but the question is, are we doing it at the expense of people's health if we're not appropriately evaluating these things? The other issue is there's this idea that somehow that these things are so important that they can't be studied properly and that you're killing people by not getting these drugs out faster. The truth of the matter is that only about 2 out of every 10 medical interventions that are studied actually works. And that comes from the industry-funded Tufts Center for Drug Development. So when you understand that 8 out of 10 products don't work, if you actually speed these things to market faster, what you're more likely to do is have those 8 get into the hands of people and harm them. So there is no need to speed an intervention to patients that is not effective or is unsafe.
So Dr. Powers, thank you so much for joining us on the Zero Hour to talk about this critical issue. I'm going to say one thing is whoever that congressperson was who told you that the pharmaceutical companies pay taxes is wrong. They don't pay taxes. They go to great lengths to ensure that they don't pay taxes. And in fact, the people who do pay taxes are the patients who are possibly harmed by these products that the pharmaceutical companies won't give us the data to ensure that they work, that they're effective. The system is set up to benefit the pharmaceutical companies when it should be set up to benefit the public health. Dr. Powers, thank you so much for joining us on the Zero Hour.
Thank you, Alex.